everyone. We welcome you to yet another session of In Dialogue Foundation's certificate course in Dialogue Studies 2023 to 2024. I'm Anshruta Bardhan Singh, a former intern at In Dialogue Foundation. Today we have the pleasure of having Mr. Vaibhav Abnave with us. He will be speaking on the topic Ambedkar, Buddha and Marx towards a possible dialogue. Vaibhav Abnave is an independent researcher and filmmaker. His research interests lie at the intersection of politics, history, and philosophy. Through his films, he explores the intersection of theatre and cinema, documentary, and fiction. He has taught courses in international politics, documentary filmmaking, and theatre studies at various educational institutes, including the Central University of Gujarat, the FLAME University Pune, the National Institute of Design, and the Symbiosis Institute of Mass Communication. Presently, he is an assistant professor direction at the Film and Television Institute of India, Pune. His films, Blur 2008 and Monologue 2013, have been shown at various international film festivals. We welcome you, sir. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Anshruta. Thank you, Behzad. Thank you, Alia. And thank you, all of you, for being here. So let me reiterate the title once more. Ambedkar, Buddha, and Marx towards a possible dialogue. Since the talk I gave last year had a title, Can there be a dialogue between religion of rules and religion of principles? This is more of a continuation of the previous lecture. Continuation in a sense that in the previous talk I was proposing that it is impossible to have a dialogue between a religion of rules and religion of principles, which are essentially two expressions which Ambedkar has coined to refer to not only two kinds of religions, but also having proper names, as it becomes clearer later, Hinduism and Buddhism. So, impossibility of a dialogue between two incommensurables, which is basically two positions, two religious positions, not having any common ground between them. That is what we were discussing in the previous lecture. Now we are moving towards a possible yet fiercely polemical and at times tempestuous dialogue between two rivals, Buddhism and Marxism. Even if I'm using the term Buddha and Marx as figures in the title, we are actually talking about Buddhism and Marxism. And yet it is not a direct dialogue between the two figures, but it's a dialogue between two doctrines. And these doctrines are reconstructed by Dr. Ambedkar, and this dialogue is also staged by Dr. Ambedkar, which is why we have three names here. Now, of course, Dr. Ambedkar was not the only one to stage a dialogue between these two doctrines. There were a few others like Dharmanand Kosambi, Rahul Sankrityayan, and few Ceylonese thinkers, or in our own times, you have Dalai Lama, you have Thich Nhat Hanh, who are interested in a possible dialogue between Buddhism and Marxism. And yet, we are actually looking at a specific singular staging by Dr. Ambedkar, which has been momentous and whose consequences still await us in our uncertain future. Now, to begin with, I would like to start with what prompted this staging in the first place, and how this fiercely polemical dialogue has been restaged across last 7 decades. So to answer this question, one needs to situate the inaugural staging by Dr. Ambedkar and then the subsequent restagings onto specific historical conjunctures, which could help us grasp the political stake of this dialogue. A dialogue which is still unfinished, which is still unfolding, and whose consequences await us. Now, the inaugural staging of this dialogue needs to be situated onto the early Cold War conjuncture. So I'll just lay out the contours of this conjuncture. By conjuncture, I essentially mean a specific historical moment which is shaped by several trajectories, forces, and so on, which is coinciding of several trajectories, which is what we mean by a conjuncture, coming together of forces. Now, one of the important contours of this early Cold War conjuncture, which is 1950s, early 1950s, though the formal address Ambedkar gives is in 1956, the process has begun in late 1940s and early 1950s. Now, one of the crucial aspects of this conjuncture is a certain impasse of the Indian political situation after the attainment of sovereign nation statehood, after the embrace of parliamentary democracy, after the institutionalization of the republic, right? So the movement between 1947 to 50, where the drafting of the constitution took place, and Dr. Ambedkar played a pivotal role in the drafting of the constitution. And yet, since the beginning of 1950s, there is an increasing disillusionment in Dr. Ambedkar's mind towards the kind of polity that is emerging in India. Right? We may have made the best of the constitution, but are we capable of living up to it, act upon it, actualize it as a society, as a collectivity? Are we capable of taking the responsibility to become a democratic society? Because for him, democracy was a form of society, a form of life, not merely a form of government. And this impasse of the Indian political actually created a certain movement within Ambedkar's thinking, which was moving away from a certain national field towards an international field. And what is happening within that international field? In Asia particularly, there is ongoing anti-colonial, anti-imperial struggles, right? Now, these anti-colonial, anti-imperial struggles are happening in the midst of conflict, war, toppling of existing regimes, not only the colonial regimes, but the pre-colonial hierarchies which were in place, the feudal hierarchies, monarchies. And there is an increasing attraction towards Marxist internationalism across Asia as a possible means of restructuring their societies. So while the Stalinist regime of the USSR was claiming a certain leadership of the communist bloc, rivaling the capitalist bloc, these Asian societies, which are struggling to come out of the colonial rule, were opening up another possibility of communism at a distance from the Cold War rivalry. And yet, in early 1950s, it was difficult to conceive of this distance because of the Stalinist leadership or the Stalinist regime in USSR. Now, moving from the conjuncture to the peculiar dramaturgy of the inaugural staging by Dr. Ambedkar. Now, he's staging this dialogue between two rivals. It's not a dialogue between, let's say, two positions which already have a certain cordial relationship. No, not at all. In fact, the traditional Buddhism which existed in the Asian societies was being increasingly challenged by the attraction towards Marxism. Because the existing Buddhism, the traditional Buddhism, the ritualistic Buddhism, which is spearheaded by the priestly class, right, was actually sharing interests with the existing hierarchical regimes, the social, cultural hierarchies, with feudal hierarchies. So it was facing a certain challenge from Marxism. And yet that is not the Buddhism which Ambedkar is interested in. Ambedkar is actually interested in studying Buddha's own teachings by going back to the Pali canon. He's actually interested in reinventing Buddhism, which would stand the test of modernity. So he's starting from modernity. He's starting from a certain commitment to universal principles, liberty, equality, fraternity. And from there on, he is going to Buddha to ask a very important question, and which he asks in Buddha and his Dhamma, that could Buddha respond to Marx? Now, this is a very strange and anachronistic question, because how could Buddha respond to Marx if Buddha existed almost 2000 years before Marx? Which means that there is something in Buddha's thought and something in Marx's thought which has common shared foundation. So these are not only mere rivals, but rivals having a common goal, and at the same time a common enemy. So what is the common goal? As Ambedkar would state, that the common goal is essentially to overcome human suffering, to end human suffering. What is the source of that suffering? The source of that suffering is in social conflict, the social conflict which emerges or arises out of acquisitiveness, and that acquisitiveness translates itself or actualizes in the form of possession, private property. So abolition of the regime of the private property as the essential precondition for attainment of happiness, a collective happiness, by reconstructing human society on the basis of certain universal principles like liberty, equality, and fraternity. So despite the 2000 years distance between Buddha and Ambedkar, Buddha and Marx, Ambedkar recognizes a certain affinity between the two, and yet within the specific conjuncture we are talking about, they are two rivals. Two rivals having a common enemy, and that common enemy is capitalist modernity, which has by then become a globalized phenomenon. Now, why are these two rivals? Because if they have common goals, what makes them rivals or competitors? Professor Soumyavrata Chaudhary uses an interesting term. He says that they are not antagonistic, but they are like counter protagonists to each other, Buddhism and Marxism, at least in Ambedkar's teaching. Which means that Buddhism and Marxism not only have common goal, common enemy, but there are certain key differences. And Dr. Ambedkar in his staging states those key differences. We can schematize those differences in three groups. The first group is regarding the means to attain the common goal. In Ambedkar's reconstruction, the Marxist means are violent capture of the state power by the party, the revolutionary capture of the state power by the party of the working classes, leading to the dictatorship of the proletariat as a necessary transitional stage to move towards the communist society. Whereas the Buddhist means emphasize upon another kind of force which is not a destructive force, not a violent force, but love as an ethical force. But love as a force has its site in transforming an individual's mind, which he calls conversion. Conversion is nothing but a subjective acceptance of universal principles, liberty, equality, and fraternity, and leading to a certain change in one's disposition. So from an earlier stage of one's mind, there is a permanent conversion to a new mentality, to new dispositions, through energization of the mind of an individual as well as mind of the world. And this is a very peculiar point in Dr. Ambedkar, that he's not isolating the individual mind in a psychological sense. He's actually emphasizing the deep interconnectedness between the individual mind and the mind of the world. And this energization of the individual mind and the mind of the world leads to a collective life of equality without the need of an external agency of an organization that externally intervenes and brings about change forcibly. So he's thinking about change in an immanent sense. Change is essentially a subjective acceptance of the principles, and through a force that is love. So it is very clear that what are the crucial differences between the means to attain the common goal. Now, there is a second group of the key differences as well, which is the duration to attain this common goal. Now, in the Marxist case, and this is the point I take off from Professor Soumyavrata Chaudhary, that the dictatorship of the proletariat produces a very peculiar kind of duration, which he calls indefinite duration, which means that there is no definite horizon to the transitory stage that is dictatorship of the proletariat. So there is a violent, forcible situation of an indefinite duration which blocks possibility of conversion and change in disposition, because there is a continuous external intervention of an agency which is forcibly trying to bring about the change, which does not leave out the possibility for a subjective change of mentality, change of disposition through the energization of mind. Whereas in Buddhism, there is a certain open duration which consists of, first, the emergence of the figure of the convert, the one who has undergone permanent conversion, which means crossing of the threshold of earlier stage of mind to a transformed stage. Then there is a localization of the experiment to create a subjective distance or abstinence from the regime of private property, which is Sangha, the Buddhist institution of Sangha, where the figure of the bhikkhu, that is the convert, practices a subjective distance from private property and provides a model to the rest of the society. A model which persuades the society that it is possible to live at a distance from private property. And this localization of the experiment would gradually percolate in all society in an unnamed duration, which is what Professor Chaudhary calls an open duration, a duration which is not prescribed duration, but which is not indefinite either. Whereas in case of Marxism, there is a certain indefiniteness, that how long will the dictatorship of the proletariat last? What will come after it? How one moves from the dictatorship of the proletariat, a stage where the property is under the possession of the state, towards a post-statist horizon, which is the attainment of the communist society. How does one make a transition from one to the other? This is Ambedkar's peculiar question. So both the first groups we talked about, one linked with the means to attain the common goal, and second, the duration to attain the common goal, both are concerned with this question. Yes, dictatorship of the proletariat, but what after that? How do we sustain the revolutionary momentum? How do we actually move towards a process of change which is not externally induced or forced from outside through an agency? Because it is precisely that agency which needs to be liquidated, which is essentially the state. That is it possible to move towards a human society without the prerequisite of state? Now, the third cluster of the key difference concerns the concrete situation of India as a caste society, or what Ambedkar calls caste non-society. And this difference is clarified through Ambedkar's intervention since 1920s and his various encounters with the left in India, the Communist Party, and the encounters which has not necessarily been pleasant. So the concrete situation of the Indian political, which is a caste society, means that it is organized not exactly on the same lines as the European societies, which were the reference point for Marx, which is the class society. So the difference between the caste and the class, where caste has an endogamous enclosure of class by regulating women's sexuality, caste as denial of common humanity and free association, caste as division of laborers blocking solidarity among them, also caste producing a double alienation, and this is a point Professor Gopal Guru makes, double alienation of untouchable laborer due to his association with dirty work, which reduces the laborer to a dirt. While in case of the worker or the proletariat in the European situation, there is a universal recognition of proletariat's work. Despite proletariat being reduced to a thing or an object, he is not reduced to a dirt. So there is this double alienation. Now, in case of the Europe or the European society, the proletariat has a power to emerge as a spectre, as a positive power, a spectre that haunts the capitalist order and can bring about its demise. But in case of untouchable, the spectre possesses a negative power which creates crisis for the touchable, not for the capitalist edifice as such. And thus, for Ambedkar, annihilation of caste and annihilation of the religion of rules that scripturally sanctioned castes are the precondition for the abolition of class and abolition of private property. Now, looking at all the three groups of crucial differences between Buddha and Marx, it becomes very clear that what makes them rivals, both at a national level and at an international level. At a national level, primarily, the competition has to do with the concreteness of Indian political situation, the distinction between the class and the caste society. And at an international level, it has to do with the question of the means of attainment of the common goal and the duration of the common goal. And yet, after considering the common goals, Ambedkar appeals to the youth in Asia to choose one path over the other. So this dialogue has both the elements. When we consider the common goals of Buddha and Marx, we actually treat them as having an affinity, sharing a common foundation, which is why Ambedkar's dramaturgy can be named as Buddha and Marx. But when drawing certain consequences from the commonality of goal to move towards the key differences we are talking about, and when Ambedkar appeals to the youth in Asia to choose one path over the other, persuading them that one path is ethically superior and durable over the other, suddenly the dramaturgy acquires a different title, which is Buddha or Marx. And Ambedkar's talk at Kathmandu, which is posthumously published, is not titled either way. It is not Buddha and Marx, Buddha or Marx, which is why it's a peculiar kind of a dialogue which starts with commonality, move towards divergences, and from there move towards a certain decision, which path to take. And that decision needs to be situated in that conjuncture of 1950s, the early Cold War conjuncture we're talking about. So Buddhism is a Buddhist internationalism which would compete with the Marxist internationalism. Sometimes even Ambedkar refers to this path as Buddhist communism. And he would argue that Buddhist communism is better than the Marxist communism. Now, this is a very interesting formulation. He is not at an international level equating Marxism and communism. In fact, he's saying that Marxism is one of the historical manifestations of communism, whereas communism is a larger project, which can have another manifestation, another path, which is Buddhism. So in this formulation, both the and the or come together. That yes, Buddha and Marx both share a certain communistic goal, but their means or their path differ. And yet, both of them have a common enemy, which is the capitalist modernity. But the means to overcome the common enemy differ. So which means there are certain limits to that dialogue. The dialogue can take us only this far. After that, there has to be a decision. But that decision does not really make these two positions as antagonistic positions. This is a very crucial point to be kept in mind. The commonality should be kept in mind, and the common enemy and the horizon to go beyond the common enemy, all of these actually constitute the conjuncture within which the staging happens. Now I'll come to the second conjuncture, where there is a reenactment of this dialogue, where we move from the dialogue to a certain fierce polemic, almost a personalized polemic within an Ambedkarite, post-Ambedkarite movement in 1970s. Now, before I come to that polemic which takes place within Dalit Panther in Western India, in Maharashtra, in the two cities, Mumbai or Bombay and Pune. Before that, let's just sketch the conjuncture. Now, this conjuncture is very different than the early Cold War conjuncture. We can name this conjuncture as the post-1968 conjuncture, which is the post-Second World War internationalist conjuncture. Now, what is the significance of this? It is basically challenging the post-Second World War international interstate order. There is a certain legitimation crisis of this order, which is erupting in different situations. So within the communist bloc, there is a split between the Soviet Union and the communist China, the Maoist China. The Maoist dismantling of the bureaucratic, authoritarian, bourgeois party-state modality, and a call for cultural revolution to reconnect with masses, with workers and peasants. Also, it is the coming together of students and workers in France, opening up possibility of a new political subject in search of a new form of organization in May 68. Also, the anti-racism and anti-imperial internationalism of the Black Power movement in the United States. Along with it, the crisis of the legitimacy of the post-colonial Indian state and the growing unrest among masses. By late 1960s. The stagnation, fragmentation, and disorientation plaguing the post-Ambedkarite movement, where the traditional ritualistic Buddhism led by the priestly class is being dominating the practice of Navayana. There are increasing atrocities upon Dalits, leading to the emergence of militant force among urban Dalit youth under the banner of Dalit Panther. So this urban Dalit youth is simultaneously disillusioned with the Indian state, the post-colonial Indian state, the ruling class, and also the post-Ambedkarite ruling classes. Those who've been fragmented, who do not really have a shared vision, who have been struggling to seek personal benefits. There is a fragmentation and factionalization, joining hands with the Congress party. So the Ambedkar's vision of the Republican Party, which was essentially to create only one opposition party which would unite all the masses, the toiling masses, the laboring masses, workers, peasants, lower castes, that has been shattered, the dream of the Republican Party, which he formed towards the end of his life. Now, within this context, there is a reenactment of the dialogue between Buddhism and Marxism. But that dialogue is already building upon a certain staging which Ambedkar proposed in 1956. And yet, the situation is different, the conjuncture is different, the stakes are different. There is a sudden spontaneous outburst among the urban Dalit youth, which has organized under the banner of Dalit Panther, resonating with the Black Panther Party, which forms that conjuncture. And within that conjuncture, we see a search for a new Marxist internationalism beyond Stalinism, beyond the party state. There is a search for a new form of organization. So clearly, there are Marxist resonances in the formation of the Dalit Panther itself. But those Marxist resonances are fundamentally different than the Stalinist Marxism of 1940s and 50s. So this is closer to Maoism. There is a certain conviction that in order to overcome the dire material conditions and the increasing atrocities on Dalits, they need to come together and seize power. They can't simply be doing the gradualist politics of petitioning. They have to interrupt this liberal, democratic, constitutional, parliamentary path, which is not really helping them to attain justice. There's an increasing disillusionment with the various state institutions, including police. So there is a harassment of Dalits at the hands of the police. So the Marxist overtones shaping Dalit Panther, it finds its expression in a document written by Namdev Dhasa while discussing with some of his fellow Panthers. It acquires a name which has a relation to the communist history, which is Manifesto. So Dalit Panther Manifesto is published in 1973. And that leads to a certain intense polarization within the Panthers. Leads to almost a breakup of Dalit Panthers on the lines of Buddhism versus Marxism. Now let's just try to schematize the two positions. Those who challenge the manifesto argue that under the name of Dalit Panther, it is actually the left, the Marxist communist forces are trying to take over this movement. Because the vocabulary, the political vocabulary is Marxist. It's almost like having a Marxist political mother tongue. This is the expression used by the leader of this faction, Raja Dhali. Says that Namdev Dhasa claims Dr. Ambedkar to be his political father, but his political mother tongue is Marxist. How can this happen? Because in Raja Dhali's mind, taking off from Dr. Ambedkar's 1956 speech, either you can be Ambedkarite or you can be Marxist. So if you are a Dalit Panther and Ambedkarite, which means you have to be Buddhist, because that is the culmination of Ambedkar's life work, conversion to Buddhism. By choosing Buddhism over Marxism, because of the differences over the means. So in Raja Dhale's mind, there is no common ground between Buddhism and Marxism possible. Because for him, Marxism is violent, dictatorial, and thus immoral. It does not really care about the ethicality of the means. And what Marxism is trying to propose or attain has already been proposed by Buddhism in ancient India, and it does not require Marxism to remain relevant. So there is a certain autonomy to Buddhism, which means that by the time we come to Raja Dhale, in the process of this reenactment, he is implicitly suggesting that the Ambedkarite Buddhism does not require to engage with Marxism anymore. Whatever the commonalities which Ambedkar discussed, we need to leave them behind, because all these are already there in Buddhism. Plus, Buddhism is ancient. So before 2000 years of Marx, Buddha has already talked about these things. And Buddhism is native to India, whereas Marxism is alien, culturally, politically alien. It's a Western import. And a Western import which focuses only upon class and not on the caste or the Varna Jati. Plus, Raja Dhale is referring to a certain tendency within the Marxist politics in the first half of 20th century, which is to forge united front. And by forging united front, Marxists tend to appropriate and subassume the autonomy of egalitarian politics manifested by groups such as Dalit Panther. So Marxist, in the name of United Front, does not allow the autonomy of Dalit assertion. It's almost like a big fish eating a small fish. That is the imagery Raja Dhale uses. So there is a certain apprehension and anxiety to call this document manifesto. So in Dhale's insistence, Ambedkarite movement, Dalit movement, Buddhist movement should be purged of Marxism, purified of Marxism, of Marxist intrusion. Now, this is a huge shift, because in Ambedkar's dramaturgy, there is a rivalry and there is an appeal, but there is a deep study of both Buddhism and Marxism. But by the time you come to this conjuncture, there is only apprehension, anxiety, distaste, enmity towards anything Marxist, anything red, anything communist, and an assertion of a certain autonomy of Buddhist, that Buddhism does not require to engage with Marxism. On the other side, within Dalit Panther, Namdev Dhasa and some of his fellow quote-unquote comrades, again a vocabulary coming from Marxists, this group does not share Raja Dhale's conviction. Raja Dhale's conviction is Panthers equals Buddhist equals Ambedkarite. And Ambedkarite versus Marxist is the foundation of separating Dalit Panthers from the Communist Party. So he's asking Namdev Dhasa that if you're writing this manifesto, why are you not liquidating Dalit Panthers and merge it into Communist Party? Why not join the party? If you're speaking their language of class struggle, of militancy, of force, of seizing and capturing power. Now, in all of this, you're not mentioning Buddhism, you're not mentioning fraternity, you're not mentioning love, compassion. conversion. You're only talking about hatred, enmity, anger. To which Namdev Dhasa and his fellows have a very important and a crucial response. And this response is also shared by certain fellow thinkers or fellow travelers of Namdev Dhasa, like Prabhakar Vaidya, for example, or Rao Sahib Kasbi. These are some of the contemporary thinkers who are usually associated with a certain Marxist communist politics. Also Sharad Patil, or within Dalit Panther, you have Arjun Dangre. Anyway, I'm not getting into the personal individual positions, but by and large, if one were to schematize this position, it is arguing that, first of all, we need to start from the reality. And what is the reality of 1970s? That the Buddhism which Ambedkar thought of, reinvented, is no longer around us. The post-Ambedkarite movement has renounced the responsibility of reflection, study, thinking, and critical engagement with Ambedkar's reinvention of Buddhism. They are slipping into a ritualistic mode. And a ritualistic mode which is heavily influenced and dominated by traditional Buddhism. So which is why the Navayana has been stagnating into ritualism, into passivity, into blind faith, into a certain kind of spiritualism which is divorced from socio-economic material concerns of Dalits. It has made Navayana into an insular creed. In fact, Navayana Buddhism has become synonymous with Mahars and other untouchables, other scheduled castes like Matangs or Chamas have maintained a distance from this. This is the reality of Ambedkarite Buddhism. Also, within Dalit Panther, if you insist on conversion to Buddhism as precondition for entering Panther, that alienates not only non-Mahar untouchables like Matangs, but also other social groups. Because they think that the constant denigration of Hinduism is an attack on them. Which means we have to start from a reality that not all untouchables, lower castes, middle castes have arrived at a certain subjective distance from Hinduism. So this is one point they make. And the second is the stagnation of Navayana Buddhism, stagnation into ritualism. So there is an urgent need to revitalize Dalit masses because there is a lack of vision among the leaders, among the Republican Party, which is splintered into several factions and so on, which has joined hands with the ruling elites and so on. So there is an urgent need for a unity of laborers, peasants across castes and religion to seize power, to challenge the dominant reactionary forces, both Brahminical as well as capitalist. Now, this is the argument which Namdev Dhasa, Prabhakar Vaidya, Arjun Dangre, and others are making. That we cannot afford to push the rivalry between Buddhism and Marxism towards a polarization without a common ground. We need to maintain the common ground. Because without maintaining the common ground, we will not be able to deal with the common enemy, which is the capitalist modernity. Because in order to deal with capitalist modernity, Marxism has remained a very important reference point since 19th century, both nationally, internationally. So if Buddhism today in 20th century needs to take the challenge of overcoming capitalist modernity, it needs to continue to engage with Marxism while stating the difference, maintaining the difference. The dialogue needs to be continued. Whereas what Rajadhale is saying that Oh, dialogue means Marxist subassumption and appropriation of Dalit position. Because Marxism is a dominant position. So it sets the terms of the dialogue, the vocabulary of the dialogue, the logic of the dialogue. And it does not allow the autonomous concepts, vocabulary, analysis, path, means of Buddhism to sustain itself. Which is why there is no dialogue possible or common ground possible. That is Dhale's insistence. That it almost reduces Buddhism to Marxism. It, in fact, presents Buddhism as a precursor to Marxism, a materialist precursor, classical, ancient materialist precursor. And it loses the sight that Ambedkar has drawn our attention towards key differences between Buddhism and Marxism also, which means he is reminding that in a dialogue, the differences are as important as commonalities. So you're overstating the commonalities and you're overlooking the differences. And yet, the situation leads to a fragmentation and dissipation of Dalit Panthas. It does not really produce a new opening. It does not re-inaugurate the dialogue. And one of the crucial reasons for that is the lack of reflection, study, thinking, and critical engagement with Ambedkar's reinvention of Buddhism on the one hand. But there is another reason that, apart from notable exceptions like Prabhakar Vaidya or Rao Saheb Kasbe or Sharad Patil, the Marxists have not seriously undertaken Ambedkar's critique, the Buddhist critique of Marxism. That is also equally important. So both these traditions are actually somewhere receding. They have not acquired the momentum after Ambedkar's death. So instead of Navayana becoming a new force, a new collective force, it has been ghettoized. It has become insular. It has become stagnant. It lacks the vitality. It has lost touch with the contemporary reality, so on and so forth. So, in fact, it is mirroring the kind of Buddhism which Ambedkar was critiquing in 1940s. Because Ambedkar was equally interested in reinventing Buddhism, reinventing the figure of Bhikkhu, reinventing the organization of Sangha. That Sangha in 20th century should actually follow, and this is Ambedkar's conviction, that Sangha in 20th century should follow the model of the Christian mission by undertaking researches into contemporary knowledges, social sciences, natural sciences, philosophy, should study arts, should study politics, democracy, continuous studying as a discipline which will give duration to the process of conversion. And through that, they need to undertake the serious task of educating the masses. But what has happened is that such bhikkhus did not emerge. So the traditional bhikkhus coming from the traditional Buddhist countries have taken over. And they have not engaged with Ambedkar's Buddhism. They are, in fact, using this as an opportunity to expand Buddhism, be it Hinayana, Mahayana, Zen, or any other. And especially because the Asian countries have capital, the traditional Buddhist countries. So they are using this opportunity. Now, from there, I come to the last part of our conversation, which is the present conjuncture, where we see yet another reenactment of this fierce polemic between Buddhism and Marxism. So, the present conjuncture in which we are is fundamentally different than the earlier two conjunctures. Because in the earlier two conjunctures, there is a certain egalitarian horizon which is thinkable beyond capitalist modernity, which people would call communism. But in our conjuncture, especially with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there is a collapse of the egalitarian horizon and a certain naturalization of capitalist modernity. it is considered now, quote unquote, the end of history as the only political vision possible or thinkable. Now, this is a huge shift and a difference between the earlier two conjunctures and ours, which means at an objective level, we see an increasing concentration of capital among the hands of very few, which is leading to incessant, continuous conflicts. Now, we see a very peculiar division of capital, assets, resources in our times, which has led to a kind of a tripartite division. That an extreme concentration of wealth in the hands of very few, let's say 86% of the wealth concentrated in the hands of 10%. Within that, also 1% has more than 80% of that wealth. And then on the other hand, you have 50% masses having absolutely no wealth, no assets, no resources, no access to capital. And in between, you have 14% of people who broadly would refer to as middle classes, lower middle classes, who are holding on to the remaining wealth, right? Remaining 14% wealth, fiercely holding on to it. So those who have wealth in their hands and those who have barely an access to wealth, both are disconnected from the 50% of the masses who do not have an access to the wealth. Right? So the extremely rich can afford to maintain a distance from the 50% who have no access to wealth. And those who have access to whatever remaining 14% wealth are struggling to hold on to it. So they do not want to maintain any kind of a contact or a connect with the masses who do not have access to any wealth. Right? So in such a situation, objectively, there is a fragmentation without any egalitarian horizon, which means that the incessant pursuit of individual profit remains the only horizon, right? Which leads to the accumulation of the capital, concentration, and conflicts on the other hand. And the conflicts primarily are the displacement of the objective situation by terming those conflicts as ethnic, racial, national, geopolitical, so on and so forth, right? Because if you do not have any egalitarian horizon before you, the only way you can think about conflict is in cultural, civilizational, ethnic, racial, national terms, not in the political, economic terms, right? Because you think that it is natural to accumulate. And at a subjective level, we see a certain disorientation and crisis, which is a subjective crisis. Now, let's elaborate on this crisis because it is something crucial for us to kind of lay out the stakes of the Buddha, Marx, or Buddhism, Marxism dialogue for our times. Now, the subjective crisis is a result of a long-standing process, which we call modernity. That modernity, to begin with, is a negative reality. It is an exit from the world of tradition. And the world of tradition anywhere is a world of hierarchical symbolization. Right? Between genders, between races, between castes. Right? The hierarchy has been the governing feature of the traditional world. And as the modernity exits from this world of tradition, it immediately embraces a capitalist path. Now, the capitalist modernity dismantles the hierarchical symbolization without constructing new egalitarian symbolization. In fact, it says that we do not require any symbolization. Symbolization is essentially a source of meaning or value, or or structuring of social existence. In capitalist modernity, the conviction is that money is the only universal referent or the source of value. So you do not require additional symbolization. You can abandon all symbolization. Accumulation of wealth and profit is the only source of meaning of human existence. Now, because of this, what we see today is a certain false contradiction between liberal democratic capitalist West on the one hand and a reactionary fascistic majoritarian fundamentalist forces on the other hand, who are claiming to return to the world of tradition. We're saying that we need to bring back the hierarchical symbolization of a traditional world, which subjugates women, which subjugates lower caste, which subjugates certain races, certain social groups, which naturalizes the hierarchy. And there is a certain conflict going on between these two forces, the liberal democratic capitalist West on the one hand, and the reactionary fascistic forces on the other. And this is a false contradiction because both of them, in their own ways, are trying to preserve or maintain two kinds of status quo. The status quo in the capitalist modernity sense, which is driven by market, accumulation of profit, and so on. And the other is a status quo of a traditional hierarchical kind. So one status quo is a result of the concentration of capital and the increasing inequalities. And the second is a status quo in the traditional sense. Status quo between man and woman, between caste, race, religion, so on and so forth. So, which is why it's a false contradiction. None of them are proposing a way out of these status quos. They are just competing that which of the status quo is a better way to organize human societies worldwide. And this is a kind of conjuncture we find today. And this leads to a greater disorientation, especially among the youth, that either we actually follow the capitalist path, which is a purely individualist path, pursuit of self-interest, right? Or we go back to the return to the older traditional world of symbolization, seeking solace, seeking redemption within that, seeking mental peace, seeking meaning and purpose, right? By completely renouncing the liberal democratic capitalist individualist world, and or move towards a certain kind of a destructive nihilism. This is a kind of a subjective disorientation we see among the young people today. And on this backdrop, we see a reenactment of the Buddhism-Marxism polemic, especially around us. And I'm referring to two texts which are recently published on a blog called Roundtable. Some of you may have heard of this. So it started with the publishing of a text which is restating a position which we have already seen during 1970s represented by Namdev Dhasa and the likes of him, which is, and it is actually a result of a fieldwork, empirical fieldwork by a doctoral scholar who's recently passed out of the Jawaharlal Nehru University, who's also an Ambedkarite activist, who has recently started a new organization which would bring scheduled castes together on a common platform and so on. And in that piece, he says that when he went to the interiors of Maharashtra, he saw actually two kinds of Navayana Buddhism among two classes. So the middle class Dalit, the professional middle class Dalit, were having access to education and occupation and so on and so forth, actually engage with Buddhism on a intellectual, conceptual plane. They read, they debate, they discuss, right? But all of this is actually to seek individual liberation. They are interested in meditation. They're interested in the Tibetan Mahayana versions of Buddhism, retreats, a certain self-help version of Buddhism. While the lower classes among the Dalits, especially coming from the rural areas, still look at Buddhism in a ritualistic manner. So Buddhism becomes actually a process of symbolization of birth, of marriage, of death, where the role of priest or the bhikkhu is very important. So Buddhist scriptures, Buddha Vandana, Bhima Vandana, coming together, singing, and so on and so forth. So it's a certain communitarian version of Navayana Buddhism, but which is absolutely disconnected from the intellectuality, from reading, from conceptualization, and so on and so forth. So this is what his observation was. And from that, he proposed that we need to remind ourselves that in order to bring Buddhism outside of its traditional slumber, from its passivity, from its spiritual mystique, we need to keep in mind that Ambedkar compared Buddhism with Marxism, that Marxism was a very important counterpoint to revitalize Buddhism. So the question, could Buddha respond to Marx, is a very important question. Because otherwise, there is a tendency within Buddhism to keep relapsing back within the traditional ritualism on the one hand, or an individual psychic spirituality on the other. This was the point he was making. And to which came a very fierce response from another research scholar passed out of the Jawaharlal Nehru University, who has also started an independent Ambedkarite organization doing a cultural work to transmit and promote Navayana Buddhism. And he actually reproduced the arguments made by Raja Dhali, saying that how come we still think that in order to revitalize Buddhism, we need Marxism? No, we don't need. Ambedkar already told us in 1956 that Buddhism is superior. Buddhism is ethical. Marxism is violent, unethical. Marxism would lead to authoritarianism, dictatorship, would lead to class war. So all of this vocabulary, which is used by the Ambedkarites today, still is entangled within a Marxist vocabulary. We need a new vocabulary. So we need to let go of a certain romantic idealization of revolution. We need to let go of our fascination with the word radical, and we need to move towards a purely Buddhist Ambedkarite vocabulary, which valorizes righteousness over radicality. So being righteous, being ethical, being loving, being compassionate is more important than using the language of class struggle and class war, revolution, radicality, militancy, so on and so forth. Now we see exact reenactment of that, but there is a vast sea difference between the two conjunctures, that there is no egalitarian horizon to our present conjuncture. So what does it mean to even talk about these two as rivals anymore? Right? Their rivalry was productive in the earlier two conjunctures because of the thinkability of the egalitarian horizon. But today, what does it mean to actually stage the fierce polemic between Buddhism and Marxism as rivals anymore? Right? Because their common enemy seem to have won out in our conjuncture. So unlike the early Cold War, or unlike the Maoist conjunctures of 1960s and 70s, capitalist modernity presents itself as not only victorious, but also natural. Natural by drawing upon a certain obscure knowledges from neurobiology, from psychology, from anthropology, and so on and so forth, that it is natural to compete. It is natural natural that there will be inequality or hierarchy. So we don't even need symbolization, the older traditional symbolization for it. Look at the world, natural world. We see hierarchies and inequalities. Where is equality? So why are we deluding ourselves that the humans can escape the natural law of inequality and competition, which is law of jungle in some ways, and so on and so forth? So on the backdrop of this, what are the true stakes of actually engaging with Ambedkar's staging today? And especially, it's a very important day today because tomorrow is 6th December, Parinirvan Din, the day of Ambedkar's passing away. See, keeping in mind the contemporary conjuncture, I would propose that thinking about the dialogue between Buddhism and Marxism today, we need to keep in mind what is the challenge before us. See, Ambedkar, while he was staging the dialogue, was constantly keeping the challenge before him in 1950s. Right? The challenge not to take attainment of sovereign statehood as the end point, to continuously politics to the pursuit and winning of political power, but about pursuit of justice. And in order to pursue justice, we need to actually move towards reconstruction of society, a society without private property, and so on and so forth. Now, today, all of that seems too distant, too obscure, too also it's been discarded as defeated, thing of the past, and so on and so forth. And yet there are, objectively speaking, mounting inequalities. Subjectively, there is a disorientation. Now, in such a situation, the first important challenge before us is to establish a sustained links and political alliance between the middle classes and the 50% of those who have nothing. Because there are fleeting coming together of these groups, occasionally over the last 15 years or so, either in Arab Spring, in Occupy Wall Street, or in the Indian situation, or the question of citizenship, right? And yet, these fleeting coming together does not really translate into a sustained organizational form, which would give duration to it. At the same time, the second challenge, which is to simultaneously fight against both sides of the false contradiction, the liberal West and the reactionary fascism. Because today, we seem to be either taking either of the sides. That we either would align ourselves with the liberal democratic West, saying that that is the better of the two, and preoccupy ourselves with the false contradiction by reproducing it. But how do we simultaneously fight against the two? The asymbolic order of liberal democratic West and a call for the older revival of the older traditional symbolization, hierarchical symbolization. We need to fight against both. Then the need to move from the false contradiction towards the true contradiction, which is to establish the true contradiction. In Ambedkar's time or in 1970s, that true contradiction was widely accepted, that the contradiction is between capitalism on the one hand and communism on the other. The only matter of debate is what are the better means to establish the communist society. Right? So the fierce polemic were regarding the means, not about the goals or the ends. So in order to establish the true contradiction, we first have to reimagine this contradiction not on a scale of a century or two or three, but on a millennial scale, on a scale of what we call a Neolithic age. So for 4,000 or 5,000 years now, we see humanity has been organized by a triad of private property, which concentrates enormous wealth in the hands of tiny oligarchies, family, in which wealth is passed on via inheritance, and the state, which protects both property and family by means of armed force. So this triad, private property, family, and the state, has been the defining feature of the Neolithic age of our species, the settled stage. And we are still living in that age, indeed, perhaps more so than ever. And capitalism is nothing else but a contemporary form of the Neolithic age. So the real task before us is to make a methodological and urgent exit from a methodical and urgent exit from the Neolithic age. That is because otherwise the human species are on the verge of extinction. Because the contemporary form of capitalism has been so destructive and has caused immense ecological destruction that we are actually faced with a very peculiar kind of situation today, that we see that we are moving towards a certain animality today, animality which is purely destructive and violent, or we are told that, oh, we are being superseded by something suprahuman, post-human, artificial intelligence, which will overcome the limits of human existence. And yet both these scenarios today are actually presented as apocalyptic scenarios, that the robots will take over the work and so on and so forth, or the ecological disaster would lead to the extinct of the human species. But both these scenarios are actually tied to the capitalist modernity and its contemporary form. So the real problem lies there. The real problem lies in terms of articulating the true contradiction between the capitalism and communism. So the millennial order, which values only competition and hierarchy and tolerates the misery of billions, must be overcome at all costs before we witness the unleashing of more of the wars which are unfolding, like the one which is unfolding in the Middle East today. So the issue is before us is the organization of societies on a global scale. It is about insisting that a non-Neolithic social organization is possible. What is the meaning of a non-Neolithic social organization? That no private ownership of what should be common, the production of everything necessary for human life, including everything that makes it worthwhile, no family inheritances, no concentration of wealth, no separate state to protect oligarchies, no hierarchical division of labor, no nations, no closed and mutually hostile identities, so on and so forth. Collective organization of everything pertaining to collective interest. And all of this has a name. A contemporary French philosopher says that it has a fine name called communism, and which need not be equated to Marxism or historical Marxism in 20th or 19th century. And yet, and this is a very important point, for almost 2 centuries, since Marx at any rate, we know that this new non-lithic age must begin. So Marx as a name is important in that regard, as a modern reminder that a non-Neolithic age can begin or must begin. So in that sense, Buddha and Marx share this conviction that it is possible to organize societies on a non-Neolithic scale at an international level. And lastly, as we exit the world of tradition, we need to work towards the invention of an egalitarian symbolism which is capable of guiding, encoding, and forming the peaceful subjective substratum for the collectivization of resources. See, this is a very crucial point, that when a collectivization of resources happen and when you use violence, what it does is it fundamentally destroys a possibility of collectivity, sociality, and fraternity. It produces fear. So, which means in order to pursue one end, which is of that of a collectivization of resource, you destroy other end, which is that of a fraternity. And that is where Buddha's path for Ambedkar becomes important, because it creates a peaceful subjective substratum which produces a certain kind of a subjective distance from private property. So when collectivization were to take place, you already feel detached from it. You do not feel that it has been violently taken away or over from you. And he gives actually example of while he was traveling across Myanmar, he found that they wanted to actually seize a land, agrarian land, in order to build a road. And that was a farmer's land. And yet, when he asked them that, how are you going to persuade or convince him? He said it would be easier because of a certain Buddhist mentality within Myanmar, there is a far less attachment to private property. So it already produces a certain kind of a subjective dispositional situation where collectivization is not necessarily externally intervened and induced. The effect, and then comes the question of the effective disappearance of inequalities, the recognition of difference with equal subjective rights, and ultimately the decline of separate state authorities. All of this is actually linked with the fact that a mind needs to be energized, mind of the individual and of the world, so that the conversion becomes a permanent crossing of the threshold without the need of external agency. So in some sense, the structural or the social reconstruction or change needs to be thought along with the psychic subjective change, which is nothing else but conversion. So today, actually, we need to bring both these visions again in a new dialogue and a conversation with each other in order to kind of reinvent what Alabadiou calls the communist hypothesis. The hypothesis that the human society can be organized without private property, without state, without the hierarchy between the manual labor and the intellectual labor, and without nations or enclosed identities or territories. And this conviction has to be first universally internalized. Only then it can unfold in an open duration. Its unfolding first requires its localization. Localization within an organization which Ambedkar points towards in Buddhism, Sangha. So we need something like a reinvention of Sangha today. What would be that? And what would be its role or the task in terms of transmitting this to the larger society? Only then this dialogue could be productive. So going back to the first inauguration of this dialogue in the early Cold War conjuncture, we have to keep in mind that the key differences over the question of means and durations are what at stake. That what are the present means today to make the egalitarian horizon thinkable to begin with? Because the earlier question of means was linked with how to sustain the revolutionary gains. Today, the question is, how do you make something like a revolutionary change thinkable to begin with? And then give a duration to politics which is not consumed by immediate concerns, but which has a long duration, a duration on a millennial scale, on a Neolithic scale. And there the name Buddha becomes very important, because Buddha arrived at this conviction 2,500 years ago. So this conviction is not necessarily new. And there has been a search to go beyond the Neolithic age for a very long time. And there, the Buddha and the Marx can also engage into a new dialogue or the conversation. Which means that modernity does not mean a whole-scale abandonment of tradition. Exiting of tradition also means that to affirm something from that tradition which is useful to create a new egalitarian symbolic order. So Buddha belongs to that part of the tradition which needs to be affirmed, because it opened up the possibility of egalitarian symbolization. And Marx's name is very crucial because it actually reminded us of the need to search for egalitarian symbolization in our own time. So this is the kind of the dialogue between, let's say, the old and the new, the ancient and the modern, which is very crucial and important for us today to take a task on a millennial scale, on a Neolithic scale. So we can maybe pause and move towards conversation.
Thank you, sir. So now I request all of you, if you have any comments, if you have any questions, just raise your hand and then I'll call out your name and then you can go ahead. Any comments or any feedback you would like to share about the talk? Anything at all?
Zikra, you have anything you'd like to share?
Poonam, would you like to share your comment or just your views about the session? Something you'd like to share? Sonal, Saida, Asna, anything, just if you want to share, just unmute yourself. Yeah, Shiraz, you have a comment. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Vaibhav, and thank you, Indialog Foundation, for this talk. I've heard some of your earlier talks, and so I'm a little familiar with the overall schematization that you're making and the juxtaposition and the dramaturgy. So what I found fascinating this time was the question, like the so-called Marxist question of what is to be done. It feels very urgent, especially when you do like a Marxist economic analysis of accumulation of wealth, going to unbearable levels, and so on and so forth. At that point, to bring this crucial question in dialogue, which is the question of scale and the question of the duration, because like I totally agree, like that we all feel the blocked subjectivity, and somehow, at least for me initially, it had attracted me very strongly towards Marxism because it felt very rational, and yet then you have all the defeats and what is to be done. Like apparently it failed. The practical implementation of Marxist principles. So somewhere I feel like, but this is so crucial, but it's not something that's really discussed as much these days. In the sense, if there, it would be lovely to have a discourse, existing discourse, right? I don't see people sort of talking about duration as a thing, because always the question is, injustice, and something like a revolt, right? And then the people who revolt are immediately asked, but what is the alternative you have, right? And then sort of like a return. So the fact that it feels like this is repeating endlessly, it feels like we're in a real dead end, whereas there is like such a tiny opening there in terms of how we could sort of think together, not giving a solution as such, but working individually, as well as like on one's disposition, as well as in dialogue. So yeah, so I I found this very fascinating, and I feel exceptionally relevant today to everyone. Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, in fact, I feel that the question of duration today has become marginalized primarily because of the loss of horizon, because it is only relation to the horizon one can think about a duration. And this is actually Ambedkar's crucial point, that at a certain juncture in the Marxist politics, the question of horizons seemed to have been bypassed, which is why the question of duration became indefinite. So, and the question of horizon needs to start with a figure, and the figure for Marxists, that of a convert. The possibility that the universal principles are internalized by an individual, which brings about a change in his disposition. From there to a localization, which is that of a Sangha, and then the duration kind of can be sustained. Whereas I think in the question of Marx, the total change becomes an important concern. Right? A total change which is also about dismantling of the structural inequalities by capture of power and by seizure of power through external agency, you hasten the change. And that is also linked to a certain ripening for the conditions of the change, which capitalist modernity brings about. That it is actually pushing the inequalities to such an extreme that it is producing an opportune moment for change. And yet, if that opportune moment does not exactly have a horizon at that point of time, it leads to, as you're saying, a certain kind of a blockage. And perhaps today, we are no longer even talking about the opportune moment. That a situation is kind of pregnant with change. As in 19th or 20th century or up till 1970s, people were thinking that while reading the Dalit Panther fierce polemic, at one point, Namdev Dhasa very kind of impatiently says that why are we fighting? The change is imminent. The new world is round the corner. Why are we letting slip it from our fingers? So that kind of a conviction that if we continue, we would be able to bring about a fundamental change. I don't think today we experience it like that. So perhaps when we are saying that the question of duration today needs to be brought forth, it has to be brought forth along with the horizon, as I would say. That a horizon, duration, localization, figure, and that figure would have a certain universal applicability, which means that anyone who thinks can undergo the process of change or transformation. It has nothing to do with his birth, his religion, his caste, his race, or any of that. It's a thinkability, the capacity to think as the very ground for change or the transformation, the subjective change. So I think perhaps we can kind of bring some of these nodal points together to think about duration.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Any other questions? Any comments?
Good evening, everyone. Sir, I have a question.
Yeah.
Am I audible? Okay. So, sir, first of all, a very, very nice session. It was very enlightening because I just could not figure out how all these topics, basically Marxism and Buddhism, like the dots could be connected and there could be some similarity between these. But I think I am a little confused and skeptical about it. I need to read a little and then I could come up with questions. But I have a couple of questions. So basically, Buddhism, what Buddha wanted to propagate, his teachings, as far as I believe, was a private thing, like self-enlightenment. And when we talk about communism, this is basically for a particular community, or maybe it is meant for people, lots of people. It is not private. So there is something. So there was this point where I was confused while you were taking the session. Another point when you talked about bhikkhus, right, sir? So like how they did not choose to have private property and stuff. So when I read Buddhism, as far as I remember, these guys were nomads. They did not even used to stay at one particular place. So basically, they did not even need a private property because they were propagating from one place to another. So there was this another place where I was a bit confused while the session was going on. Plus, I really need to read a little about this, and then I could come up with more questions, sir. Yeah.
Yeah. So about the question of the private as opposed to something collective, I think Ambedkar's point is that in Buddhism, what appears as private is an individual opening which does not limit itself to individual. Because the transformation individual undergoes is transmitted or is transmissible. So in Buddha and his Dhamma, there comes a point where after undergoing enlightenment, Buddha is faced with a dilemma to preach or not to preach, which means to keep whatever enlightenment he has attained to himself as an individual liberation or to transmit it, right? And he decides to actually preach, to teach. And that's how we know Buddha's teaching. So, which means whatever was private for him, which he attained in isolation, let's say, was transmissible. And that led to actually transformation of other individuals and their subjectivities. So that is actually the link between the individual and the collective as we go from the Buddhist side. From the Marxist side, you're right that we are thinking about change at a collective level in Marxism. And there one hits a roadblock that how to sustain the change. Do we force the change from outside, or do we persuade the people to change? Or how do we persuade the people to change, which means how do we educate them? Again comes the question of transmission. And there I think Ambedkar feels that in Buddha, the question of transmission has been dealt with in a much profound, deeper manner than any, let's say, reformer or any revolutionary thinker. That because any change has to be localized. So what you're calling private is basically the beginning, the first step, but which does not remain confined to oneself, because our individuality is shaped by the existence of other people, because our individuality does not exist in isolation. It is always social. So the social and the individual is entangled or intertwined, right? And this is where the question of morality becomes important for Ambedkar, that we don't need morality if we are living alone or in isolation. We need morality because of the coexistence with others. So the social is the very precondition for individual or private. This is actually the beginning of both Buddha and Marx, that we are social individuals or social beings. So whatever we call our private is also shaped by the social. The distinction between the public and the private, the individual and the collective, all is enveloped by social, which is coexistence. So our individuality does not have any meaning apart from its relation with other individuality, the recognition from other individuality. So what we're calling dialogue in this case, that only with dialogue we actualize or realize ourselves. So our individuality in that sense is dialogic. About the private property, historically there have been very different kinds of practices because Buddhism traveled worldwide. And at different stages, you see different codes of conduct emerging. Ambedkar is actually referring to Pali Canon, and in Pali Canon, a certain code, which is Vinaya, what bhikkhu can possess. So what is minimally required for him or her to conduct his or her life. And the nomadism was not natural to them. It was a conscious decision to maintain a distance from possession, to not let attachments be created, which is why they chose nomadic form of life. Because if you are settled, then the attachments begin. Attachment with land, with people, with property, right? So nomadism is in some sense a form of life which does not let the attachments take shape in the first place, right? And second, nomadism allows you to transmit, to preach, to educate. So it has both the sides to it. One, a distance from private property, and your role as a preacher.
Any other feedback, anything else?
Can I ask?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much, Vaibhav, and in dialogue for arranging this talk and bringing up the Ambedkar Marx in terms of a dialogue which continues over years and over decades, goes through a moment of change within the country. So I'll be speaking specifically about the Indian situation as a dialogue with the European situation. So not in isolation. So if we see our constitution and the state that we have established at the moment of 1947 to 51 as the means for a certain kind of emancipation, a certain kind of those means were, in a sense, decided democratically, not through a particular revolutionary dictatorial way.
Right.
But so it has all the elements. It has all sorts of things in those debates are being discussed. And again, it's a dialogue. Through dialogue, this state, Indian state, has sort of emerged, and which till now we have asserted are our means to sort of move beyond this, let's nation, capital, state kind of a situation. So this peculiar situation of the Indian Constitution and the state that it establishes seems to be somewhere in between a transitional, which itself gives a duration in a sense. This constitution. So today the question seems that which way is it going to manifest? It has, as a process, it has possible ends, possible different ends. And as far as I understand, this constitution came through as a dialogue between the Cold War, as a taking sides in Cold War, in a sense, could be seen as it, between liberalism and communism. So what are your thoughts about this? In a sense, yeah, if we say constitution, something that comes out as a dialogue itself, which you already spoke of.
Mm-hmm. So, see, constitution as a legal document may emerge through a dialogue, but is not always necessarily a product of a dialogue. It could be a product of impasse, of compromises, of contradictions, and so on. Ambedkar himself very eloquently speaks about it. This is while handing over the constitution, that we are entering a life of contradictions. That there is a political equality, but there is no social and economic equality. So, the things which are urgent and essential are not necessarily enforceable legally, but are put within the directive states of state policy, directive principles of state policy, and so on and so forth. So, yes, dialogue may have taken place lead up to the drafting of the constitution and, in some sense, the acceptance of the legal document. But it may not, dialogue may not have truly reflected in the document itself. So this is actually the very peculiar and a crucial point, that it is a temporary resolution of a certain dialogue. So which means that the dialogue needs to continue to go on even after the process of drafting the constitution is completed. That is, I think, Ambedkar's crucial point, which is why he separates between constitution as a document and constitutional morality. So there is a distinction between, let's say, political emancipation and a human emancipation. These are the two terms which we can take from Marx's Jewish question. So human emancipation cannot simply be limited to political emancipation, because there is a tendency within political emancipation to be crystallized, to stagnate. It loses dynamism. It starts becoming resistance to the process of change itself. It may have been a result of the process of change, but then it starts blocking the process of change. So keeping all of this in mind, the dialogue now has to be taken outside of the Constituent Assembly. And I think Ambedkar continues with that dialogue by directly appealing to the people. So which is why the second book which he drafts, Buddha and his Dhamma, is in some sense that kind of a book where there is a dialogue with an open duration. Whereas constitution as such does not have an open duration, because the duration of the constitution is actually hinged upon the sovereign state power to back it, right? Because otherwise it's an empty document. And as long as the sovereign state exists, the constitution has a certain validity. So there is a very peculiar kind of a double bind between constitution as a foundation, but constitution as vulnerable to the very existence of a certain regime. So with the reconstitution of a regime, there is a possibility that constitution itself comes under a threat, which is why in certain states, there are several constitutions which we see within a short span of time because of this vulnerability of constitution to the ruling regimes and so on. So today, in fact, to see what happened during the CA-NRC protest, people were actually reading out preambles in public spaces with Ambedkar's and Gandhi's photograph and so on and so forth. They were actually reclaiming the constitution as people and not as citizens. That we the people, which is the beginning of the constitution, but which is inserted towards the end of the drafting of the process, is actually going back to that moment of constituting, which is to say that we need to reconstitute the republic. So the moment of constitution, the constituent power and constitution as a legal document needs to be kind of separated, people and citizen and so on and so forth, where they were kind of reclaiming the open duration while speaking in the name of constitution. But it is not to guard constitution as a legal document, but to re-inaugurate the process of constituting. And the process of constituting is nothing else but for Ambedkar, converting principles into rules, which is to move from universal principle to its applicability to dispositional change, to practices, to localization, so on and so forth. So to reconnect the two, because otherwise constitution as a legal document can become a document of rules. And which is why the question of jurisprudence becomes very important to debate upon the principles, from where a certain debate emerged about the basic structure of the constitution in 1970s. That what is it that cannot be changed, cannot be altered, and so on and so forth.
Thank you so much.
About Tulika's earlier concern about reading, maybe what I can do is I can share some initial readings with you through Beza, then that might help. In fact, Ambedkar's 1956 speech, Buddha and Marx, is also widely available. You can look at it on internet. I can also share with you.
For sure, sir. I'll check them out.
Yeah. And for the contemporary disorientation, I'll share a couple of short chapters from Alabadio's new book called New Dawn for Politics. So,
sir, is there anything else you'd like to say, or any other participant, and we can end the meeting? Okay, so thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful talk. And there is a lot that we have to think about, and it was very insightful. So thank you so much, sir, and thank you, everyone, for being a part of this talk. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.